and welcome to Canary Media's discussion on clean energy in a time of global conflict. I'm Julian Spector. I'm a senior reporter with Canary Media, which is a nonprofit news outlet that covers the transition to clean energy. Thank you all for joining us in this conversation today with Senior Senator from the state of New Mexico, Martin Heinrich. Thanks for joining us, Senator.
Oh, really great to be here. Longtime follower of Canary, so it's a pleasure to join you today.
Well, we're glad to have you. There are a lot of foreign policy and national security wonks out there. There's a lot of experts on clean energy, but Senator Heinrich is the rare expert in both of those areas, which is valuable because the two topics are increasingly intertwined following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Senator Heinrich is known for his work on shifting the U.S. to a clean energy economy that supports workers, tackles climate change, and reduces environmental pollution. But he also serves on the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and oversees appropriations for military construction, so very steeped in the national security policy making at the highest levels. In recent weeks, the senator has argued that the U.S. and Europe need to end dependence on Russian fossil fuels as quickly as possible by electrifying essential systems like heating and transportation and powering those activities with clean electricity. So this argument I find very interesting because it takes clean energy out of the realm of local or domestic policy, which is usually where it's talked about, and inserts it into the realm of international relations. The purpose of our conversation today is to investigate what that new intersection of clean energy and national security means for both areas. So, Senator, to kick this off, you've thought a lot about both of these topics. Could you give us your high-level theory of how the U.S. should be using clean energy technologies to serve national security interests right now?
You bet. And I think in the current context of what we see on the news every day coming out of Ukraine, it's really important to realize that Russia uses energy as a weapon. This is something they use to leverage their influence in the world, as well as something they use to finance the actual illegal aggression and invasion that you're seeing in Ukraine itself. And so when you listen to some people talk about energy security, national security, international security, you will hear that if we were to just drill more, we would change that dynamic. And the reality is that because oil in particular is a global commodity, that's really not the way it works. So the most effective thing we can do to deleverage Russia, because they are such a large producer, not as big as us, but such a large producer of oil and natural gas, is to dry up those markets and especially make it so that they can't use their leverage on whether to turn on a pipeline or turn off a pipeline to get what they want, particularly out of the Western European context.
Yeah, and that's interesting because that kind of reframes energy security, which is a conversation that's usually dominated by who's got the supply of oil and gas. And we're hearing, oil and gas industry groups in Washington pushing for more drilling, open up more land and more facilities for export as a solution to this. But I'm struck by, we're sitting on the tail end of the shale revolution where the U.S. is producing far more oil and gas than anyone thought possible, 20 years ago. And yet we're still seeing these record high gas prices. Yeah. It seems like the abundance of U.S. domestic oil and gas production hasn't insulated us from these price shocks. So how is it that
one of those dynamics is that national security dynamic, and us producing more has not effectively deleveraged Russia because the world is dependent on fossil fuels. But you make another point, which is separate, but just as important. It hasn't cushioned our consumers, right? So it's important to realize that the price that we see at the pump is really set internationally. It's not dependent on the supply and demand dynamics here domestically. And then it's also important to realize that we send a huge amount of the oil produced here overseas. And if you told the average American citizen that, they would be shocked. But that's because the industry for many decades has not built new refining capacity in the United States. And so the old refining capacity was built to take crude from places like Russia, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, a certain, sort of brand of crude, and refine that here. So we actually end up selling a lot of what we've produced in recent years overseas, where their refining capacity is set up for our production. So long story short is more production. You never see that at the pump. You don't see prices come down. And you certainly don't deleverage one of the most aggressive and criminal entities in the world today in Vladimir Putin. So the real long-term solution here, and we need to start investing in it yesterday, is to really fuel switch. Most consumers don't care. They don't care where their energy comes from. They want a car that works. They want hot showers and cold beer, right? Like they want energy services. And switching all of our energy services over to clean, domestically produced electricity, and in Western Europe doing the same thing, investing in their capacity to get off Russian gas, deleverages Vladimir Putin, builds economic resiliency here in the United States. It's the way forward to achieve energy independence and address our climate challenges.
Gotcha. And this is, of course, building on the really rapid technological growth and declines in price for solar and batteries, and heat pumps are not as far along maybe in that cost curve coming down, but they give us the opportunity to heat and cool homes with electricity. But could you dig into what specifically should the U.S. be doing to get those technologies out in the world and apply them? Because at the end of the day, they have to be installed on the ground in a house, by an installer who's getting their supply from a manufacturer. And, there's a lot of steps in that causal chain that are maybe out of control of the U.S. government. But what leverage do we have to make this happen faster?
Well, first off, I think we need to set both industrial policy here in the United States and consumer policies that accelerate that. I'm the author of something called the Zero Emission Homes Act that really seeks to hit consumers right at the point of sale and give them the ability to levelize the cost between the newest, most efficient electric technology, say a induction stove, for example, instead of buying another gas-consuming gas stove that's going to produce pollution in their home. If you can levelize those price points, the consumer will make the smart decision. And we're getting to the point where once they're levelized in any given technology, as we saw with solar, once it crosses over that line and is cheaper than everything else, it's off to the races from there. We can also, we need a workforce piece of this, and it doesn't have to be disconnected from the security position in Western Europe. If we were able to engage with countries like Germany and the UK to rapidly take American production of heat pumps and replace those in European homes and use Americans to help scale their workforce, send them trained installers who can teach the installers, really ramp up their ability to have home heating and office heating that is based on electricity instead of on Russian gas. Then that same workforce comes home to the United States afterwards and helps us scale our domestic capacity here. And those jobs they're great jobs. They remind me a lot of the kind of work that my dad did growing up. He was an IBW lineman. He always drove a panel truck. It had a ladder on top, but it was, the same sort of blue collar, highly trained workforce that he was a part of is very analogous to the heat pump installers, the electricians, the plumbers, who will really drive this revolution on a local level.
And so that's interesting. So we need more installers who know how to put heat pumps in just for the long-term electrification of the United States. So you're saying would it be the federal government could be employing a workforce to actually go to Europe right now? And
that's exactly right. You could literally use any of these service corps that we have created over time to train the trainers and have people in Europe helping countries make this shift as rapidly as possible. And you could use tools like the Loan Office at DOE and the Defense Production Act to create the demand among American manufacturers so that we're also scaling up our capacity to produce that technology for the world. First, to deploy that as rapidly as we can in Western Europe, but then to meet the demand in the United States and transition our own infrastructure to the healthiest, most efficient, non-fossil technologies and really benefit our workforce and benefit like the quality of life that people have in their own homes, because these things simply are a better mousetrap.
And does Europe need us to make this happen? Is there any sort of American hubris involved in saying you need our expertise and our heat pumps and going into a place with a different kind of electrical system and saying like we're the right ones to be doing that?
I think right now Europe, what they need is not to be told what to do. They've already decided to make this shift. And if we meet them as supportive partners and allow the Department of State to negotiate what that support looks like and to come in with and fill in and really scale the pieces that they will be able to do, because they're very competent. They just need they need to solve this problem faster than any country normally would, because we're on a war footing, right? So to be able to get this, as much of it done before next winter, when their next real crunch will happen, and when Russia will have maximum leverage over Western Europe. We've already asked them, hey, would you turn that pipeline off, that Nord Stream 2 pipeline? They never opened it up. Now they're seeking to roll back their demand substantially to try to eliminate the Russian gas next. And that's kind of an all hands on deck. I don't think we should be telling them what to do, but we should be offering up our partnership. Yeah.
And I mean, with that urgency, it's hard to build any kind of normal power plant in that time frame. You certainly aren't going to open a new liquefied natural gas terminal in less than a year. But do you think home heat pump installation and that kind of intervention actually could get going in that time frame?
I do. I mean, it's just about installation, and prices get set at the margins. So, they're already going to be asking people to turn down the thermostat next winter. They're going to be fast tracking their renewable generation. They're going to do a lot of different things to try to reduce that supply demand imbalance that gives Russia economic leverage over them. And if we can add a few percentage points to that and then really push and scale in partnership with the Europeans, then we can be a very meaningful part of that solution. And long term, I mean, what an enormous benefit. For 30 years, there was an assumption in Europe, in places like Germany in particular, that Russia had turned a corner permanently. And certainly with Vladimir Putin in charge, we now know that is not true. We can be one part of the solution, and the EU has already made really strong commitments here, but one part of the solution that frees them from that leverage so that they can do whatever is in their best national security interest, and they don't have Russia sitting there being able to turn the dial up or down on their energy pain.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, if you're faced with the choice of continuing to depend on Vladimir Putin for heating in the winter or just doing it with your own locally produced electricity, seems like a very obvious choice. They didn't necessarily make that in the past, but things are different now. So in terms of what it would take on the U.S. side to make this happen, and how much can just happen through the executive branch, or do we need to see some acts of the legislature to turn these ideas into reality?
Well, I think certainly the initial scaling of industrial capacity, there are tools like the Defense Production Act that are really designed to meet these kinds of needs. That the foreign military sale approach, there are tools that the administration can use that would help us really scale our manufacturing and give some certainty to manufacturers here in the United States that their investments in increased production are going to be met with actual orders. And that would be very helpful out of the gate. And on the back end, we do need Congress to step up and create those incentives that would then take over and sort of, once we have this manufacturing capacity in place, use it for our own transition and our own workforce development here in the United States.
Gotcha. And so, you've written some open letters to the White House kind of advocating for this. Are you in ongoing conversations making the case for this?
Yeah, I've had conversations with several people in the White House about this. It's a new idea, but it is one that I was pleased to see the very first time I went to the White House after some of the initial pieces were published. People were reading it and asking questions, and we're going to continue to push this as one more tool, one more sort of arrow in the quiver of how we should deal with Russia's aggression. And unfortunately, I don't think that this is a conflict that's going to be gone in a few weeks. So the ability to continue to press this solution is not going to go away, and we're going to continue to make this case.
And then you mentioned legislative action. Sounds like you were alluding to the package in the Build Back Better, which is stalled, but there was about $500 billion of funding for clean energy, and that included a lot of these building electrification items. I think everyone's getting a little tired of the will they or won't they storyline around Build Back Better. But are you seeing any openings in the context of this post-Ukraine invasion world to rally Senator Manchin and others around energy security, with clean energy being a pillar of that?
There are ongoing conversations, and I'm not going to prognosticate. I will just say that there's a surprising amount of consensus around some of the very important tax clean energy and then investment clean energy provisions. I think what really hung up the overall Build Back Better in December of last year was really disagreement around a number of the social provisions. So that does give us some direction in which to engage on this and say, well, is there a package here that we could move forward in the short term that really supports our national security goals, but also helps us build our economy here at home and really begin to address the intensity of this climate crisis. I just got back to DC from New Mexico. We're in full fire season mode now. It's April. I've never experienced that before. It didn't happen historically. There's still snow in the mountains, but we've had these incredible winds as the climate has shifted that we get in the spring that run 60, 70, sometimes 90 miles an hour. That is driving a fire season like I've never experienced. It's certainly not at this time of year. So the climate crisis itself is something I feel a great deal of urgency around, but we can also align these things in ways that are good for the economy, bring down costs, which is one of the major pressures most people are under right now, and support our national and world security stance.
Right. It's really doing good things across the board in a way that maybe traditional approaches, you could get the energy security, but you wouldn't be tackling climate change, with more fossil fuels. I wanted to reflect on some comments you've made publicly comparing home electrification to the Victory Garden, from World War II, where it's a personal action you can take in your own home that serves this broader national mission. I think it might be a little harder to draw a connection from someone in Albuquerque, putting in a heat pump to strengthening the U.S. in a global conflict with Russia. But could you play out that causal chain for us, and how
I think
that works?
It's similar in the sense that it gives an individual who cares about the state of the world right now and the state of our own country power and control over their own life. There was a narrative for a long time, that the only thing they could do is tell some other decision maker how to fix climate change in particular. Now people are beginning to understand that a huge portion of the fossil fuel that we consume is actually directly tied to their decisions. And I don't mean that we don't need systemic change. We absolutely do. But you can support that systemic change by being a first adopter, by being the person who swaps out a fossil gas water heater for an air source heat pump water heater, or makes that investment in one of these new electric vehicles. That not only has a big lever on climate, but it also has the spillover impact of making us more energy efficient. Those electrons are going to be coming from home. They're going to be getting cleaner every single year as there's more deployment of renewables and storage on the grid. And that's going to reduce demand for fossil fuels, which is an ideal way to deleverage the influence that someone like Vladimir Putin has right now.
And in terms of how that then affects the international space, if the U.S. can drastically reduce gas consumption for heating buildings, for instance, doesn't that just open up that gas supply for export? So if Europe does still need some gas, they can, we now have more flexibility because we're not consuming our own production as much.
Well, and in the short term, we're going to have to do things in the short term in Europe. However, we can both protect consumers and do the right thing on a security basis, I think we should do. I don't think we should be doctrinaire in the middle of a war about being willing to share natural gas with Western Europe in its moment of need in direct conflict with Russia. But long term, really, when you start taking large industrial nations like the US and backing out our demand for fossil fuels, whether that's oil or fossil gas, that changes that margin of supply and demand in a way that can also bring down prices for those folks who are still using those commodities. And the producers, some of the malactors out there, are also lose their position, their relative position of influence on the world stage. Those are all positive dynamics that we as a world leader should really lean into.
Gotcha. Well, turning to another aspect of clean energy and national security, the president did recently invoke the Defense Production Act for the minerals that go into the clean energy supply chain. So this will designate the supply chain for clean energy as a matter of national security and opens up new executive powers to help us get more mining and more local sourcing for the elements that make our batteries and make the solar panels and all of that. Can you tell us how significant you think that action is, and then what are the follow-up actions that you want to see to really make the most of a robust domestic supply chain here?
I'm probably not the expert on this. I was fairly familiar with mining dynamics, having a father who did exploration for Anaconda Copper, a grandfather who worked in gold mines in Nevada. I'm not sure how great a fit the Defense Production Act is for this sort of supply chain work, because it's really more of a commodity issue than a industrial manufacturing dynamic. But I think it's clear that we are going to use more minerals going forward, that we're going to have demand for copper, demand for nickel. Right now, we have substantial demand for cobalt. My hope is to see that, until we can get supplies that don't come from the DRC in Africa, it would be good to lean in on these cobalt-free batteries and storage. But writ large, we're going to need to produce more minerals. Lithium is another great example. I think the challenge is really social license, because there's been this very long history in the places that have the most minerals, which is largely public lands in the West, where the original exploration and mining activities never got cleaned up. So you have local communities that rely on water for drinking water, for irrigating crops and agriculture, for recreation, everything from rafting to trout fishing, who are very dependent on that clean water and don't want to go back to the dirty way we did things before. And we haven't updated our mining laws. So if you're going to create the social license to be able to produce more lithium in the United States, produce more copper in the United States, you really need to have a 21st century clean, green approach towards how you produce those minerals. And so my guess is that if we're able to make progress on that, it ends up being a balance of increased production, but also more responsibility with how and where you do that production.
Mm-hmm. And that echoes a broader trend we've been seeing of, even if it's clean energy, motivating the intervention in a landscape, that still triggers pushback. Even places, states that want a clean energy transition might not be happy about a solar plant and, in the rural fields near where they live. And, so we need to figure out how to get the minerals we need for all these carbon-free and non-polluting technologies without messing up the landscape.
Yeah, the details really matter. I mean, one of the places I've invested a large portion of my life, well over a decade, in getting transmission built. And siting really matters. Local buy-in really matters. And I'm just now starting to see some of the lines that I've been working on for years get to the point where they're actually either being built or getting ready to break ground. So the details on this stuff are incredibly important, because they can either build momentum or they can engender more backlash. And looking for creative ways to make these things work for everyone is an important part of how you make this change successful over time. One of the things I'm really interested in is the idea of agrivoltaics. And that's true because, one, you can produce clean energy, but at the same time, you're using that space for a dual purpose. You're either creating horticultural opportunities, grazing opportunities, or just pollinator gardens that support the rest of that agriculture. I think we need to think creative about how we sometimes turn adversarial groups into supportive groups.
Mm-hmm. Well, we only have a minute or two left. So I thought to wrap things up, I want to hear what you think about something from your national security world that you think the clean energy community should learn or appreciate, and then what's an insight from your understanding of the clean energy world that should be more broadly understood in the national security realm. It certainly, in my experience reporting on this, feels like those communities are very different and are not always talking to each other. And I'm curious if you have any ideas of how to bridge that.
Where we saw this nexus really acutely, and it is engendering a conversation quite strongly among national security folks now, is when we were embroiled in both Iraq and Afghanistan. The thing where we lost so many service members, including, I can think of one person I knew that was doing this kind of work. We would send out these long convoys, right? And they would move people and fuel around. And fuel was like the big one, where those convoys were really at risk. They were really just oftentimes moving diesel to things like forward operating bases or other locations where we needed it. That whole system was not secure. We lost so many service members in doing that. It really started to make people think about efficiency and how we run these forward operating bases. And could we power things in a different way and just at least cut down on the number of those convoys. And it really did spawn conversations that are still happening in national security circles and especially defense circles today about how we maintain our defense in a way that is more independent and less dependent on these fossil commodities, these hydrocarbons. And I think that's such a win-win when you can save life and limb, that it's going to continue as a conversation that also supports our national security.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So using clean energy technologies to deal with the vulnerabilities that come from depending on fossil fuels, and maybe you still, need the fossil fuels for some of your mission critical activities, but to the extent that you can sort of choose how much you need, that strengthens your hand and gives you more room to maneuver.
Yeah, and it is really breaking through in those national security circles. I'm seeing now aircraft that are solar driven, that are able to act like a mini satellite and stay up 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and operate in spaces where you really don't want a pilot working anyway. So there are a lot of benefits to this that are bleeding over into national security, and the national security infrastructure is starting to appreciate those benefits.
Well, that's great to hear. I think at that point, I'll say, Senator, thank you so much for your time and really digging into, not just the high level, but also getting down into battery chemistries and the nuts and bolts of how this clean energy transition can actually happen. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you. It's been really great to be able to have this opportunity.
Yeah. And then thank you to our audience for tuning in on this Tuesday afternoon. If you want to revisit this conversation, we will be posting a recording of it on canarymedia.com later this week. So tune in for that, and make sure to follow us on Twitter and get the newsletter to hear about upcoming events like this. We always love to be responsive to current events and bring together conversations in a timely way on, how the world is making progress and dealing with the challenges around decarbonization and building a clean energy future. So with that, I'll call the end of this, and hope to see you all next time. Thanks.